All right, hello everyone. My name is Jeremy. I'm an alcoholic.
Jeremy.
Get a couple things set down here. First thing I'd like to do is say thank you to everyone in this room for allowing me to be here tonight. Any opportunity that we get to share about the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, the 12 steps of action that are laid out in front of us, and the power of a power greater than us, or our God, that comes into us and flows into us and changes our lives, is one of the most beautiful experiences we get to share. And that's one thing that I want to make sure that I put out in the front of that, is how powerful that program is and what God's done in my life. So as I share tonight, I hope that you get to hear that. I'd like to thank the committee that put this conference together for allowing me to be here tonight. You know, we all have a story to tell, and we all have a story to share. And my story is not better than your story, it's just my story. And so, you know, I hope that as we're going through this weekend that you can find things that you relate to people as they share in this program and can help change our lives. One more thing, I want to thank the crew from Little Rock that came up here to support me this weekend, because I love all of y'all. We've got our DCM here, Trey. Thank you so much for being here. I've got Edie and Tim, Yolanda, my beautiful wife Sherry sitting right back there, and my friend Paul. I want to tell you something about Paul. Now, I shared this the other night, is that a lot of people look at Paul as like a back row Baptist, because if you ever come down to our meetings, he's going to be sitting in the back. And people look at him that way. But that's not the way that I look at him. I look at him as a man that loves other people. And he's willing to do anything for anybody. And thank you. All right, now we got some tears out of the way there. So Cotton and I were talking before the meeting, and he was sharing about a tie experience and showing up somewhere to share and not having a tie. And here not too long ago, it was about a month and a half ago, I was asked to go to Akron, and I was up there with 5 generations of sponsorship for me. My sponsor, my sponsor's sponsor, his sponsor, and his sponsor. And I got to share my story up there whenever I was there. It was an extremely powerful trip for me to be around that kind of sobriety and that kind of environment. But I get up there and I realize I didn't have a tie. And I didn't have dress pants. And I'm talking with my sponsor, and he's like, well, do you have a button-up shirt in your coat? And I was like, yeah, I do. And he's like, it's okay. He said, don't worry about it. So then we're in a meeting the night prior, and the lady looks at me, and one of the people that were up there with us, he looks at her and he says, so when people share up here, what do they normally dress in? She's like, this is Akron, man. We dress to the nines, you know, suits and ties and all the stuff. I looked across the table and I said, thanks for asking, and now tomorrow we got to go buy me a suit and a tie. So we ended up looking, and we ended up at the local Goodwill. And hey, look, you can get some amazing things there. And I've got some wonderful ties out of that Akron trip. I got some frogs. I got some koala bears. You know, look, everybody loves a good tie. But I want to say something about this tie that I've got on tonight. And that's why I bring this up. As I share my story tonight, you're going to learn how I burned down my life. And you're going to learn how God brought things back into my life. And this tie that I have on was given to me by my son on Father's Day this past year. And this tie clip says Papa J on it. And that's what my grandkids call me, is Papa J. And I have no right, because of the way that I acted and I lived my life, to be in their life today. But God saw fit to bring them back. And that's why I bring that story up. That's why I bring that story up. Because, you know, we all go through this period of alcoholism, and if you are an alcoholic like I'm an alcoholic, you're going to show up to Alcoholics Anonymous on the doorsteps and be absolutely incapable of caring for another human being. I would absolutely walk over you to get to that next drink whenever I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, because I could care less about you or anything in your life. And that's where whenever I sat down and I met Bobby, I don't really want to talk about me, because y'all are going to hear my story. I want to know about you. I want to know about you. I want to know about you and your life and what's going on in your life. And so, we allow people to come share those experiences with us so that we may build on that foundation that we have. And so, I'm Jeremy. I'm from Little Rock, Arkansas. I was born into a family that had no real alcoholism to speak of. My mom and dad are still married today, been married over 50 years. They don't drink. My mom drinks, on occasion. It's just, here and there, typically whenever she's out on trips. And my dad has never really drank. Occasionally he would drink the, little cider here and there. And so I never grew up around alcohol. I never grew up around seeing people drunk. I had no reason to become an alcoholic. It was just not something that I knew. I didn't know that people were alcoholics, and whenever I thought of alcoholism and I thought about alcoholics, it was the guy living on the street under the bridge that was homeless and sitting out there drinking, right? That was the vision of alcoholism that I had. It wasn't a guy that was still married, had his house, had his kids, had his wife there, had his cars, had a job. It wasn't any of that. And, so whenever I'm sitting here and I'm evaluating my drinking, I'm like, man, I can't be an alcoholic. There is no way, because I've still got a job, I've still got a house, I've still got a wife, I've still got 2 kids that, not to mention the fact that those 2 kids really didn't want anything to do with me. And my wife were fighting constantly, nonstop, right? But I grew up in this household, and we went to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. If the doors of that church were open, there was no reason why we weren't going to be there. The only excuse was if you were deathly sick or we were out of town. You were going to that church. And in that church, here's what Jeremy learned. I didn't learn about God and Jesus, all the things that they want you to learn about church. I learned that this God that they talked about is this guy that's going to come out of the sky, and he's going to grab you when you do bad, and he's going to break you in half, and he's going to snap you off, and he's going to send you straight to hell. That's what I learned, right? Because they're bringing these people up, and well, this guy, this lady's daughter goes to a different religion, and well, you're going to hell because, this is what the things that I'm hearing these people say. And this is this young little child's mind picking this stuff up. And as I'm starting to get older and I'm starting to do things, I'm running from this God that I've had this thing. And so now I'm in this constant, race of running from God, right? And, as I got older, at the age of 16, my cousin comes over and we take a drink together on my 16th birthday. And he and I split a bottle of liquor. And at the end of that night, I wasn't taller. I wasn't funnier. I didn't look better. I wasn't smarter. All I did was got as sick as I could possibly be. But when that night was all said and done, there was something inside me that said, I want to do that again. I want to do that again. And I don't know what that phenomenon is. I know now today that that's an allergy inside my body to alcohol. That phenomenon of craving that it talks about in the book. And, that set me off and running. But during that period of time, from the time that I was, in my teen years, my 10, 11, and 12, we moved from Little Rock to a little bitty town outside of Little Rock. And one of those things that happened when we did that was we moved from the big city of Little Rock to a little bitty town of less than 12,000 people. In the city of Little Rock, I'm just one of a bunch of kids, and I've got all my friends. I'm making straight A's. We moved to that town, and now all of a sudden I'm an outsider. I'm trying to still actively play sports, but I can't get a starting position on a sports team, so now I'm an outsider. Nobody wants to be my friend because I'm not from there. But this newfound alcohol that I have found, if we're drinking and we're drugging, I want to be with you and you want to be with me. And I have this innate fear inside of me to being alone. I do not want to be alone at all. I don't want to have separation because, I lived for so long in that town trying to find friends, and I was struggling to do that. But once we started drinking and drugging, all bets were off. Things were fun. You wanted to be around me, I wanted to be around you. We can have a good time and we can all, come together when it's all said and done. Now, at the age of 17, I meet a wonderful young lady. And when I meet that young lady, she is, becoming, everything that I'm wanting my life to be. She's got a 3-month-old little boy. That little child I fall in love with. I will tell you that even though biologically he's not mine, you will never be able to convince me that that child is not mine. I love that little boy with every fiber of my being, just like I love my wife with every fiber of my being, just like I love my daughter with every fiber of my being. And I fell in love with that little boy, and her and I started dating. I'm getting into trouble. Things are starting to happen in my life. It's not real things. I'm not on a winning streak at that particular point in time. And, I do the one thing that I can do, right? I've got a young lady that I want to be with. I've asked her to marry me. There's a young child in the picture. And so my dad was in the military. I'll go ahead and share that with you. My dad was in the military. He retired, at the rank of E9 out of the military. And I always knew that I wanted to be in the military. I shared this not long ago. It's an easy path for a young boy, especially when your dad's in the Air Force, right? The easy path of a young child is you want to grow up, go to school, go to the Air Force Academy, become a pilot, fly in the Air Force, become an astronaut. Boom. That was my dream as a child. My mom still talks about it today. She'll remind me all the time. You remember when you were little and you wanted to go to, be a pilot and all that stuff? All of that went away as I started drinking and living my life differently. And now, like I said, that young lady's there and that young boy is there. I'm going to do something to provide for us. And that providing for us is I always wanted to be in the military. I wanted to be in the biggest and baddest branch of the military. And so I joined the United States Marine Corps at the age of 18 years old. And whenever I was 18, I graduated high school. I went to boot camp. I ended up graduating boot camp, went to my job training, went back to my first duty station, came back, we got married, and whenever she finished her first year of college, she moved out to North Carolina with me. And we were living together, and our life was great. But what I didn't realize, and I didn't know it until after I got sober and I started doing some honest evaluation of how I was drinking at that point in time, was just because I didn't drink every single day, just because I wasn't drinking every single night. We would go and we would drink and party, and we would drink to excess. We would drink until it was all gone. We would drink until we got sick. We would drink until we passed out. And that was what we did when we partied and had a good time. Sure, there were times whenever I could go have a beer at a restaurant. There were times when I could have a beer at my house. But almost every time that I think back on that I really drank, it was always excessive drinking. Always excessive drinking. And now, when you think about the time frame that I was in the military, in the Marine Corps, I went into the Marine Corps in 1996. I'm in the Marine Corps in 2001. And the world changes. And I had somebody looked at me that day, and they looked at me, and it was one of the guys that I worked with, and he said, "We don't understand the gravity of this right now, but there's going to be people we know standing around us that aren't going to live through this." And in 2003, I'm in the Marine Corps, and I deployed to Iraq, and I'll tell y'all, I loved the Marine Corps. Loved it. It was absolutely my absolute favorite job that I have ever had, was being a Marine. I love being a Marine. I was very good at being a Marine. I advanced through the ranks of being a Marine very quickly. And whenever we got to Iraq, I realized real quickly that I wanted no part of being a Marine anymore. And whenever I was there, I made a decision to get out of the Marine Corps, and we come back home. We moved back to Arkansas after I get back. And in 2005, I like to tell things in chronological order because it gives you a representation of the progression of the disease of alcoholism. In 2005, I'm standing in Walmart on the Sunday night before school starts, and the world comes alive around me. And all of these voices are talking. And if you've ever been in Walmart the night before school starts, it is packed. People are in there getting school supplies for their kids, and all of these voices are saying the same thing. Jeremy, I'm going to kill you. Jeremy, I'm going to kill you. And no matter what I tell myself, I cannot make those voices stop. And I look at my wife and my 2 kids, and I looked at my wife and I said, I can't do this anymore. And I walked out and I left my wife and 2 kids in Walmart. And as a man and as a Marine, it's very demoralizing. Incomprehensible demoralization. Incomprehensible demoralization. That was the first time that I can consciously say that I used alcohol to cope with what was going on in my life. Because I went home and the only thing I knew to do was drink. To kill those thoughts and kill those emotions and kill that pain that was inside of me. And we get home that night and my wife looks at me and she says, "What's wrong with you?" Wasn't the last time that somebody's going to ask me that question. I promise you I get asked that question a lot over the course of the next 13 years. And she says, "What's wrong with you?" And I said, "You know what, honey, I don't know." But I just kept drinking. A few years down the road, she's looking at me and she's like, "Something's got to change. Either you're going to stop drinking or we're not going to be, we're not going to be what we are." And I take that as we're getting divorced. She says that that's not what she meant, but something had to change, right? Well, just like any good alcoholic, I stopped drinking for 30 days. I clean up my act. I stopped smoking. I start becoming a model citizen. And then something happens. The proverbial something happens. And I leave work that day and I get me a bottle of liquor and I go home with a pack of cigarettes and I commence to drink that bottle of liquor that night and I smoked that pack of cigarettes and I woke up the next morning feeling exactly the way you would think. What have I done? I feel like total crap. And here I go, off and running again. And the next thing you know, I'm trying to do things to change my life. I'm working with a friend of mine and he and I are talking about, man, we're drinking a whole lot. I refuse to call myself an alcoholic. I'm not going to call myself that because, that's just not where I'm at. I'm not at a place where I can consciously say that. But I get an opportunity to go to Italy. And now I'm contracting for the military. I get an opportunity to go to Italy. Well, I told you that I didn't want to be alone. I don't like to not have people around me. Causes me to drink so that you'll want to be around me. And I'm thinking, man, if I can just get away from home, get away from her and the kids, and maybe I can change, and maybe I can change the way I feel. And I go to Italy, and I'm thinking about all of the good times that I had in the Marine Corps, deploying with my buddies and going to all these countries all over the world and doing all of these things. And I get there, and I take one thing that never crosses my mind on the way there or the preparation to get there. It's a solo gig. And now I'm in another country by myself, curled up in a hotel room, drunk, crying, listening to the voices bang on the door that they're coming through to get me. And there is nobody there. There is no one there. And I would love to say that that's where my alcoholism stopped. But that was really just the beginning. I come home and I'm drinking daily. I'm drinking every single day. And all of a sudden, my wife is on me about, why are you coming home and sitting in your chair drinking? Why don't you want to spend time with us? Why is that all you want to do? Well, then now my son's up here in Jonesboro. He's in college at Arkansas State. My daughter's at home taking the brunt of my alcoholism. And my wife looks at me one night and she says, pour me a shot. And that's her story. And that's for her to share. But all of a sudden now we're drinking buddies. And we're no longer husband and wife. And we're drinking. And we're drinking every single day. And we're going to the gym, come home, drink. You know, go to work, go to the gym, come home, drink. Go to work, come home, drink, go to the gym, come home and drink. Go to work, come home, drink. And it gets real ugly real fast in a home with two alcoholics. My son is gone, he's up here, he's not really having to see a whole lot of it. My daughter is telling him, Mom and Dad are alcoholics. Like, I need your help. And my daughter's taking the brunt of this. And then all of a sudden, and this is where I tell you, I would absolutely step over you whenever I got to Alcoholics Anonymous. My daughter goes to school one day, and she tells the counselor, my parents are alcoholics, my mom hit me, and I need help. And the counselor calls us in and talks with us. DHS shows up and talks with us. And the DHS worker looks at me and my wife across our kitchen table and says, well, I told your daughter if I had a daughter like her, I'd probably drink too. And I think y'all should go put her in an institution and let her learn a lesson. And in my alcoholism, I took my daughter that night to an institution and I dropped her off. A 17-year-old little girl, screaming and crying, saying, Dad, please don't do this. And I turned around and I walked away and I went home and I drank. I promise you, alcoholism will take you to depths and places that you never think that you'll ever go. It's one of the hardest things that I still share. It's one of the hardest things that I still share. But if I ever forget that, I'll become that again. I share that as much for me as anything else. Because I love that little girl with everything I have. And if I were sober, I promise you I would have never done that. I would have never done that. So this takes place in 2016. I promise y'all it gets better. It gets better. So now we're going to start getting into some fun stuff, but I am going to share a couple more things before we get into that fun stuff. In 2016, my daughter, whenever all of that happened, she looked at me and she said, Dad, whenever I turn 18, I'm moving out of your house and you'll never see me again. She graduated high school in 2016, and whenever she moved out of when she turned 18 in that year, she moved out. She got an apartment, she moved out, she did exactly what she did. When she graduated high school, the very next Monday, she started a CNA course, and she was off and running on her pathway to becoming a nurse. And I love her tremendously for her desire and determination to become that. But she did, she followed through with what she said. In 2017, we get down to 2017, man, I'm telling my wife that this is our year. This is the year that we change our lives. And within 30 days of 2017, I'm drunk, I'm arguing, I'm yelling, I'm screaming, I'm kicking doors in. I've got a dog that's 130 pounds. My wife doesn't want me to drive down the road. Okay, I'm going to stop for a second because I normally ask this question. Has anybody ever here got sober because of a dog? I have met one lady that said, I did. Pretty great. Her dog told her, said, are you really going to do that again? My dog, I guess, told me the same thing. Back to where we were. We're fighting, we're arguing, we get locked in a room, and my friend back there, Tim, is laughing because he loves this story. We're fighting, we're arguing, we're locked in our bedroom, and I go to walk out the door. That dog thought that I was going after her, and that dog jumped on me and bit me all up and down the front. I grab hold of the dog, and I'm trying to pull him off as I'm laying on my back. And I'm going to tell y'all, I would much rather fight a 300-pound man than a 130-pound American Bulldog. We get the dog off, and now I'm bleeding. Now I'm driving down the road to go to the emergency room anyway, drunk. We get there. They call animal control. Animal control comes, picks the dog up. Dog comes back in the house, or I'm missing a large part of this. In 2016, along with that, a very good friend of mine that I worked with, he and I drank and drug together at work. And in 2016, he came in from having a back surgery. Well, what do you get when you have a back surgery? You get prescriptions. And I have this date circled on the calendar when he's coming back to work, because we're going to have a good time. I go get the alcohol, he's bringing the other stuff. And he walks in, and I ask him, hey man, good to see you. Did you bring the stuff? He reaches in his pocket. He pulls out a silver coin, much like this one, and he tosses it to me. And I catch it, and on the back it said, to thine own self be true. And on the front side it had a triangle that said service, unity, and recovery around it. And he said, Jeremy, I'm sober. And I said, that's good for you. Did you bring the stuff? And he said, no, I had my wife flush him down the toilet. Now, that friend was in the room not long ago whenever I shared my story, and he said, I always wanted to tell you, I took all of those, but I didn't want you to think bad of me. But that's our alcoholic thinking, right? That's the way our minds think during that time frame. Okay, anyway, we're going to go back forward. So, in 2017, when that dog got a hold of me, at the end of that week, I'm blacked out. I told y'all my son's living in Jonesboro. He's got his brand new fiance that I've only met like once. They show up at my house on Friday morning after I've been blacked out drinking for a week. And I told y'all, a lot of people in my life have asked me, what's wrong with you? And my son shows up, and we're sitting down in my garage, and he looks at me and he says, Dad, what's wrong with you? And I said, son, I don't know. And I can't be an alcoholic. I refuse to use those words. So I called that man that I worked with, and I said, I can't stop drinking, and I don't know what to do. And he said, Jeremy, the only thing I can tell you to do is go to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I remember telling him, that sounds a bit extreme. Thank you very much. I don't think I'm there yet. Have a good day. Okay. Next person that comes to my mind is my father-in-law. I know that he's done some work in the prisons with alcoholics and addicts. And so I call him up on the phone and I say, I can't stop drinking. I don't know what to do. And he says, Jeremy, the only thing I can tell you to do is to go to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I said, that sounds a bit extreme. Thank you very much. I don't think that I'm there yet. And he said, well, hold on a minute. He said, I'm going to send you the number of a guy. Just call him and see what happens. And for some reason, I picked up the phone and I called that man. And he's a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And he said, Jeremy, he asked me that next day, he said, Jeremy, do you think you have a problem with alcohol? And I said, I think I do. And he said, okay. He said, when you get home tonight, look in your mailbox. I think there's going to be something in there for you. He said, whenever you get that out of there, he said, there's going to be some Roman numerals in the front. Turn to this Roman numeral and read that. And he said, tomorrow at this time, call me and let's talk about it. And for 30 days, this man, even though I refused to go to meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, I only was willing to go meet him one time. Every day on his lunch break for 30 days, he would answer the phone and talk to me. All the while I'm still drinking. I cannot physically separate myself from alcohol. Cannot physically separate myself from alcohol. But he's taking his time. And at the end of that 30 days, I'm like, man, I'm not wasting this guy's time anymore. Now he's starting to kind of push like, we need to start meeting. Maybe you should go to some meetings. Oh, by the way, there's a convention coming up, next week. It's called Winter Holiday. Maybe it'd be a good sober event for you and your wife. And I'm like, man, I ain't going to hang out with a bunch of losers. That ain't happening. And I'm like, man, he's starting to push too much. We're done talking. And so I stopped calling and I start drinking again the way that I want to drink. And that's the way that the rest of my 2017 went. My sobriety date is October the 16th of 2017. But from the course of February of 2017, I went to an AA meeting in March. I walked in there and I listened to each one of y'all share your heart and your love. And when you shared, all I heard was, you're a terrible person. You're horrible. If I did that, I would drink too. This guy said that he had 20 years sober, and I would swear that he's drunk right now, and I'll kiss his feet if he's not. And I walked out of there, and I hit the closest liquor store, and I bought a bottle of liquor, and I went home, and I got drunk. And I told my wife, I said, Alcoholics Anonymous is out. There's a 4-step in there that says I'm going to have to do an inventory. And honesty is out. I am never telling anybody my deepest and darkest secrets. That is not going to happen. And we get down to September, and I've got a dream job. I'm loving my life. And that dog that got me 30 days into January is back in the house. And I take a drink of tequila one morning after my wife are fighting. And I slam that bottle down on the counter. And I hit the cabinet above me. And I instantly hear something hit me from behind. And now I'm fighting that 130-pound dog again. But this time it's behind me, and I can't get a hold of it. And now I know that the gig is up. The gig is up. To where I asked if anybody's ever gotten sober because of a dog. Now we're going to stop here for a second and we're going to talk about a couple of things. Most important thing to me in my life today is God. And when I think about dog, it's a 3-letter word. Spell that word backwards, it spells God. The number 3 is extremely important to me in my life. We talk about the first 3 steps. We certainly spend the time we spend in those first 3 steps trying to understand that we are alcoholics. Am I powerless over alcohol? Is my life unmanageable? I'm going to learn all of those things as I go through those first 3 steps. Came to believe that a power greater than me could restore me to sanity, right? Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand Him. And there, in those first 3 steps, we start building this relationship with a God that I can understand, right? You're going to understand, and I'm going to share more about the number 3 here in just a few minutes, and the reason why that is so important to me in my life. Because I wouldn't be here today if that number didn't exist. Or those first 3 steps. I go to a treatment center and I go through detox. When I walk into that detox, I'm going to tell y'all right now, there's been many, many miracles in my life. God works in wonderful, wonderful ways. When I walked into that detox center, my blood pressure was 214 over 195. I had been drinking over a 1/5 of liquor every single day for over a year. On October the 15th of 2017, I finally came to a realization after 9 days of hardly eating, just drinking, that there was no amount of liquor in that liquor store that was going to change the way Jeremy felt about Jeremy. I had no belief in God, but I'm laying in my bed, drunk and crying, and I said, God, if you're real, I can't do this anymore. And the urge to drink alcohol instantly left my body. I went to sleep that night and I slept better than I had slept in years. I woke up the next morning and I could barely walk across the floor. I couldn't hold a cup of water. I was in such severe DTs that thankfully a couple of my friends from work showed up and they said, Jeremy, what's going on? And I said, I'm an alcoholic and I can't stop drinking. And they got on the phone and they called somebody in and they said, if he truly has been drinking the way that he says he's been drinking, you better get him to a detox center fast. And when I walked in, I heard the nurse behind me getting something. And as I'm looking up at that blood pressure machine, and I see the face of the nurse standing in front of me, and the face of the nurse in front of me says, you can't give him that, the doctor hasn't ordered it. And the nurse behind me said, if I don't, he's going to die right here. I came out of that 7-day all-inclusive Airbnb. And I still refuse to go to Alcoholics Anonymous. I still refuse to go do that. And so, my wife is getting sober at that point. I have no idea how long I've been sharing here. My wife is getting sober at that point. In about 2 weeks out of that detox, I'm dropping her off at her IOP program. And she looked at me and she said, Jeremy, what are you going to do tonight? Now I can tell y'all, I had a plan. But there was one of 3 things that was going to happen that night. I was either going to go drink because I was already sick of Jeremy. I was going to go home and kill myself, or I was going to do something different. And I knew from being in that detox that there was an AA meeting right down the hall where that treatment center was, inside that treatment center. And I looked at her and I said, there's an AA meeting in there tonight, and I think I'm just going to go see what happens. And when I walked into that meeting, I can't tell y'all who else I met that night. I can tell you who I think I would have met, but there was one lady standing in that meeting that night. And when I walked in, she gave me a hug that was filled with so much love. And that was the love that I needed to feel, because even though I lived in my house with my wife, we were living as 2 separate people. And I hadn't felt loved in such a long time. And she gave me a hug and she said, Jeremy, I don't know what your story is. She said, but I can promise you that if you'll come here and you'll stay here, you'll be able to live a life better than you could ever even imagine. And at the end of that meeting, they said, we'll be back here again on Monday, come back. And I went back on Monday. And when I left on Monday, I had gotten more hugs, More people said, we're really glad you're here. And they said, we'll be back here again on Thursday. Come back. And I came back on Thursday. And I just started going back. Everybody started talking about, you need to find a sponsor and start trying to work through the steps. And, I'd already told y'all, I'm not working through the steps. It's not going to happen, right? Well, I'm a Marine, and I'm looking around the room, and I'm scanning, and there's a guy that comes in the room that night. And he had never been in these meetings before that I had seen. And he's got a Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm, and I'm thinking to myself, if there's anybody in this room that's not going to make me do all of the things that I don't want to do, it's going to be another Marine. He's going to understand what it's like. If y'all ever meet my sponsor, you'll understand that this was God doing for Jeremy what Jeremy couldn't do. So I asked that man that night, I said, look, I need a sponsor. I need to work the steps. Would you be my sponsor? And he looks at me and he says, well, go home and pray about it tonight, and if you still feel that way tomorrow, call me. Oh, what, you don't think I'm good enough? You don't think I can do it? You don't think I can be sponsored? Well, I'm going to show you the next morning. I'm going to call you up, and I'm going to tell you I still want you to be my sponsor. So I call him up. Well, here's what I didn't understand. This was Mr. AA in Little Rock. Alternate GSR of the group, District 9 treatment chair, eventually went on to be the area treatment chair, GSR of the group. Now he's the alternate DCM for our district, Mr. AA. That too Jeremy picked to be his sponsor. And he said, okay, great. He said, we're going to get to work. He said, you're going to call me at this time every single day. And he said, we're going to start working through the steps. And he said, but the first thing you're going to do is you're going to go home and you're going to turn to this Roman numeral and you're going to read this and you're going to write the answers to these questions. And we get through, there is a solution, and I'm like, talking to him that day on the phone, and I'm like, dude, when are we going to start working the steps? And he says, if you haven't noticed, we are. And I'm like, God. Always the last to know. Always the last to know. We're the last to know that we're an alcoholic. We're the last to know that we're working the steps. We're the last to know that God is doing work in our lives. The journey that he and I talked to him beforehand, because I always try to call him right before I share my story, because, I need to get grounded, and I need to get reminded that I am absolutely insignificant in the grand scheme of things. And whenever he tells me that, he tells me in love. And that's because that's what his sponsor tells him. And it's rooted in this, and it's rooted in this alone. I am simply a vessel. This is God's message. And as long as I pray beforehand, and the words that are coming out of my mouth are the words that God wants me to share, and I'm not trying to think of this up here in my head and interdict my own self-will in it, then it's God's story. And it's not Jeremy's story. Man, I worked through the steps. We're a couple months into this deal, and he calls me on a Friday night, and he says, Jeremy, what are you doing tonight? And I'm smart aleck, and I tell him on the phone, going home and not drinking as usual. And he says, good. He says, go home, get your big book. I'm going to send you an address. Meet me there at this time. I go home, I get my big book. Last thing I want to do on a Friday night is go home and get my big book and go somewhere. We show up there, we're at a treatment center, and we're doing a literature study, and I'm sitting in there, and I'm like 30-something or 60-something days sober at this point, and working the steps, and I'm quiet for this entire hour, not saying a word. He comes in, and at the end of it, and he looks at me, and he says, Jeremy, do you have anything you'd like to share? And it's a man with 30 years of sobriety, my sponsor, and me. And I say, I'm so new that I can't carry the message to you, but if you ever need a ride, I'll give you my phone number, and I'd love to carry you to the message. And that man with 30 years changed the entire course of my sobriety. Because he looked at me and he said, Jeremy, never discount your sobriety. He said, you with 30 or 60 days, however long it was, can relate to the people in there better than I can with 30 years. and I got on fire for treatment. I started signing up to go to every treatment commitment that I could go to. I started going to more meetings. I started working the steps faster. I talked to my sponsor more. My life started to change in ways that I never could have imagined. And I didn't see it. I didn't see it at the time. I can look back on it now and see it, but I didn't see it at the time. 6 months sober, our group's treatment rep comes to me and he says, man, you've been going to the treatment committee meetings with me. You know, you've been going to treatment centers. I've got to step down because of work. Would you be willing to be the group's treatment rep? Well, I've got to talk to my sponsor first. He said, well, I've already talked to him and he said you can. And you know, I was told by my sponsor, my grand sponsor early on, if Alcoholics Anonymous asks and it's a reasonable request, the answer is always yes. The answer is always yes. And that was a reasonable request. And Alcoholics Anonymous asked. And it made me a bigger part of my group than what I could have ever even imagined. I got to serve as my group's treatment rep. I got to serve as the alternate GSR with Edie when she was the GSR. I got to serve as the District 9 treatment chair. I just finished a rotation as the Area 4 treatment chair. And then now I'm getting the privilege of serving as the secretary for my district. But you know, I've made some wonderful, wonderful friends in Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, my relationship with my wife today is something that I would not trade for anything. We have a beautiful, beautiful relationship. Just this year alone, we have started out last December, went to see a bunch of Christmas lights up in in Branson, you know, in Silver Dollar City. In March, we went to Key West for the first time. We went to Omaha, Nebraska to watch the Razorbacks play baseball for an entire week in the College World Series, something I never thought that I would get to do. We've been to concerts. We've been to Akron with a whole group of people. And I know I'm going to leave out all kinds of stuff, and that's just this year alone. Just this year alone. You know, in just this year alone, my son has a 2-year-old son. They lived in Seattle. When him and his wife got married, they moved to Seattle. They moved back to Jonesboro. They eventually moved to Little Rock. And now they live within just a few miles of my house. And that's a kid that whenever I was drinking wanted nothing to do with me. He wanted nothing to do with me. Just the other day, that little boy, who's a little standoffish, because I didn't see him a whole lot in his first year, and there's a reason for that, and it wasn't alcoholism. But just the other day, I'm over there at his house, and I'm knelt down in the yard, and I'm getting ready to leave, and this little 2-year-old boy that's standoffish inches a little closer, and a little closer. And then all of a sudden, he comes running with his arms open, barrels into my chest, and gives me a hug. I shared this last night at our birthday night. That's the juice. That's the juice that we get in Alcoholics Anonymous. That little girl that I caused all that harm to, in 2023, she lived in our house while we were in St. Louis. She bought a house that's not far from us. It's about 20 minutes from us. She had a little boy in 2020. The first people that got to keep that little boy was me and my wife. The first place where he stayed overnight was at me and my wife's house. And now she's got a little girl that's about to turn 2. And we almost miss those things when we're out there drinking and drugging. That's the stuff we lose sight of. That's the stuff we lose sight of. We don't think about the damage we're causing to other people when we're drinking. You know, early on I learned that you have to give this program away if you want to stay sober. Young gentleman walked in the room in 2018, and I knew him, and my sponsor looked at me after the meeting, and he said, "You know that guy?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Good." He said, "Call him tonight and ask him if you can work through the steps with him." And as I'm starting to speak, my sponsor says, "This is not a request." And so I called that gentleman that night, and I asked him, I said, "Man, I'd love to work you through the steps." And so he and I worked through the steps, and that was the first guy that I ever sponsored. I'm going to share with you, I sponsor a lot of men today. That gentleman did not stay sober, but I did. We have this process that we go through in Alcoholics Anonymous where the lights come on, and it's one of the biggest joys that I get to see today. And I was sharing with Bobby earlier that the biggest thing that I can ever wish to be today is a servant. That's it. Be a servant. Be a servant to others. Watch newcomers come in the room, watch the lights come on. Because one day I was that newcomer that walked in the room. I started meeting a lot of people. Now I'm going to tell you, that convention that I talked about earlier, Winter Holiday, has saved me from being inside my mind more times than I can tell you. I go to that convention early on. I've got some things going on at work in 2019. I'm wanting to commit homicide. I go to that convention on a Friday night, and I listen to the lady that's sharing, and I go up to her afterwards and I said, "You prevented me from committing homicide tonight." That's the way Alcoholics Anonymous works. One alcoholic sharing with another. 2020, I was diagnosed with one of the worst things that I thought could ever happen to me. In 2019, that number 3 that I talked about. In 2019, a lady that I worked with came up to me one day and she said, "Jeremy, I really think you ought to go to the doctor and get your lungs checked out." I'm like, "Okay." She said, "You probably got something going on with your lungs, especially the right side." I thought she was crazy. Brushed it off. That little girl that I caused so much harm to comes to my house. She's in nursing school, and she says, "Dad, I really think you ought to go talk to the doctor." She said, "I think you got something going on breathing-wise." And I'm like, "You're in nursing school. You're hypersensitive about everything that's going on. We're just going to let that bypass." June birthday night at my home group that year, the third person comes up. It's a lady that's a nurse. And she pulls me to the side, and we're out there eating birthday cake, and she said, "Jeremy," she said, "I'm going to ask you some questions." And she runs through this list of questions, and she's asking me, "Have you ever been diagnosed with blah, 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 blah?" All of them have to do with lung function and breathing. And I said, "Look, I'm going to answer your question, but I want to know one thing. Why are you asking me this? Because you're the third person that's asked me this year." And she said, "Well, hold out your fingers." She said, "Your fingers say you're not getting enough oxygen to the tips of your extremities." And so me and my wife have a trip planned to St. Louis, on to Chicago, to watch my favorite baseball team play. I love baseball. I go to the doctor a few weeks before our trip happens. Doctor says, "Man, the x-rays say that there's something going on. There's something there. The lung function test says that something's going on. I'm really not sure what it is. I'm going to send you to a specialist." The day I got that phone call, I called my sponsor. I said, "I have lung cancer. I'm dying next week. I don't know what I'm going to do. What should happen?" And he says, "Well, hold on a minute." He said, "The doctor hasn't told you that there's really something going on. He thinks there's something going on. Wait until you get to the specialist and see what happens. And oh, by the way, stay off Dr. Google during that time frame." So me and my wife, we go on our trip. We come up here to Jonesboro, visit my son. We get in the car. We drive to St. Louis. We stay in a hotel, spend a few days in St. Louis. While we're in St. Louis, we walk from our hotel to an AA meeting. In the process of walking from this hotel to this AA meeting, we walked through the campus of a medical school. Told you about that convention. Go to that convention in 2020. The very next day, I'm having a lung biopsy. That lung biopsy confirms that I have pulmonary fibrosis, a disease that is incurable. There is nothing that they can do about it. That doctor starts spitting out statistics. People at your stage of progression can live and blah, 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 blah. I go numb, stop hearing what he's saying. And almost a year to the day, me and my wife, after the advice of that young nurse that came up to me at my meeting, said, I talked to a doctor and he said, if this is truly what you have, you need to go to Nashville to Vanderbilt, or you need to go to St. Louis to Barnes Jewish. And almost a year to the day, we're staying in the exact same hotel going to that medical school campus to see a pulmonary doctor. They're looking at it and they're like, yes, that's what you have. We don't know how fast it'll progress or how slow it'll progress. There's no rhyme or reason with this. Some people can get diagnosed with it and die within a week. Some people can live the rest of their lives and it never get any worse. So there's really nothing we can do except for just monitor it. And over the course of the next several years, that's what they're doing. You know, I'm continuing to progress in Alcoholics Anonymous and grow in my program and grow in my relationship with God. This God that I didn't know and didn't understand. You know, whenever I first get into the program, it's this God of good orderly direction, the group of Alcoholics Anonymous, and my sponsor. Over the years, that's progressed to become something different, right? And I hope that you can find that yours progresses and changes over time too, and continue to grow in this program. In 2023, I know that something's wrong. I had a surgery in January. The next week, I walk up a flight of stairs. I about pass out and fall over backwards. The next week, I'm walking out of the gym and God tells me, Jeremy, you're going to die this summer. And that's okay. Within a month, I'm on oxygen. Within 2 weeks of being placed on oxygen, that oxygen isn't enough. And they're trying to continue to keep up with that from St. Louis to Little Rock. Within another couple of weeks, I'm in the hospital in St. Louis, and they look at me and they said, Jeremy, you need to decide whether you want to go on a transplant list because we don't know if we can stop this. They get it slowed down enough that I can come home, and they said, you need to go home and get your stuff in order, and we need you to be back here in a couple of weeks. And so I go home, I spend Easter at home, and on April the 9th I show back up, maybe April the 9th, maybe April the 10th of 2023. I show back up at the hospital, I'm admitted into the hospital, and the next thing you know, within a month, I'm on life support. There was one doctor that would walk in, and he was rounding that last week that I consciously remember. And he was rounding, and he would always walk in that week, and he would say, you know, how you doing? And he would talk to me, and he would, at the end of the, whenever he was leaving the room, he would always tap me on the foot and say, don't worry, it's going to be okay. We're going to find you a set of lungs. By the end of that week, it's getting really bad. I visited with my daughter and my grandson multiple times. My son, who I destroyed a relationship with in sobriety, is now back in my life. He's told me that him and his wife are going to have their first child that year. When I hadn't talked to him in over a year. That was whenever I found out about that. I'm sorry. My wife is up there, and my parents have come up there. I've seen everybody that I need to see. And at the end of that week, I'm really, really struggling. And that doctor walks in, and I'm like, I don't get it. How bad do I have to get? And he looked at me and he said, Jeremy, he said, I don't know. He said, but I'm concerned. I go on life support on around about May the 5th. I go into cardiac arrest and I die. The doctors bring me back. They take me off the transplant list. All of this is happening without me knowing. They take me off the transplant list. On May the 9th, they come in and tell my family that they found the perfect set of lungs for me. And on May the 10th, they transplanted an IV drug user's lungs into my body so that I could stand in here with each one of you tonight. Try to honor. I don't know who that young man was. I don't know who his family was. But I try to honor his memory every single day. And live a life that he would be proud of, and the life that he couldn't. We never know who we're going to touch in this life. We never know who we're going to touch in this world. There was a gentleman from Batesville. Before he passed away, I had an opportunity to spend some time with him, and that friend of mine that I asked in 2016 and could care less about whether he was sober or not. He told me one day, I told him one day, I said, if there's ever anything I can do for you and your family, you let me know. And he calls me and he says, man, he says, my dad's really sick. They're transferring him to Little Rock. My mom needs a place to stay. Can she stay with you and your wife? And I said, absolutely. Absolutely. No questions asked. Get to spend some time with him, that gentleman that got brought down. And he's got a trach in and I've got a trach scar in the center of my neck. And I remember he couldn't talk. And I asked him, I said, after 20 years of sobriety, does it not get old? And he scratched out on a pad of paper, if we live one day at a time, we never get old. I can fall into the trap of living in the fear of the wreckage of the future, or the fear of facing my past. But if I live one day at a time, that's all that matters, and I'll never grow old. Thank you for allowing me to share.